Welcome, Adrian Tchaikovsky. So Adrian is an award-winning author whose books include the Children of Time series, the Final Architecture series, and the Shadow of the Act series. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me on.
So where did it all begin, Adrian? Where did your love of books all begin?
My love of books as a reader began very young, basically at the local library. I got in at a very young age. I got into reading the Target Doctor Who novelizations,
Ah,
which there were like a million of, and every time you went to the library, there were either new ones or there were old ones I hadn't read in a time and was happy to reread, and I just kind of plowed through those,
hmm,
and then eventually kind of graduated onto like the regular science fiction shelves, which at that point were just this enormous wall of yellow spines with no cover illustrations, which is not actually the most encouraging thing for a reader. But I worked through that and lots and lots of just whatever was there and looked interesting. I picked up a remarkable number of very disappointing spy thrillers because they had scorpions and things on the cover. Yeah, and it's just the library really was an enormous godsend for me.
hmm.
And I was very lucky to have a good, well-stocked library in the area.
Yeah, I was pretty much the same actually as well. That's pretty much where I got my love of reading from. Where did it all lead to writing then? Where did you first start exploring?
Well, the intervening step between reading and writing is role-playing games for me.
Right.
So I was from about age 12 a very keen role player, especially as a games master. And if you're doing that, and if you're not just using pre-published stuff, as I didn't, you make up a lot of worlds and you make up a lot of characters.
Hmm.
And most specifically, you are doing it for an audience. And even if it's only an audience of like 3 to 5 players, it's still you are producing stuff for other people.
Yeah.
And then at about age 16, 17, I ran into the Dragonlance Chronicles by Weiss and Hickman. And they are someone's novelization of a role-playing campaign. And that was just this incredible light bulb moment of this is the thing I could do. There is this bridge from where I am now to actually being a published novelist. And then that became my ambition. It took me a long, long time. It took me about 15 years to get my style up to spec, honestly. So like I suspect an awful lot of authors, I had ideas from the get-go.
Yeah.
And because of the role-playing background, there are a lot of transferable skills in the way you create world and characters and so forth. But writing style is a separate thing, and
Yeah.
writing style does take time to develop. I mean, it's one of those people always ask writers, where do you get your ideas from? And ideas are not a problem with the majority of writers, I think. Where do you get your style from is another question. It's kind of and is far more interesting because that comes from a long period of practice normally, and also it also comes from basically everything you've read, because when you're reading, you're learning how to write.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, you're famous for your world building, aren't you? And I know you've mentioned before in other interviews that you were fascinated as a kid with nature documentaries about insects and that sort of thing. Was that love of biology, did that all stem from the same sort of source, the world building? Did you want to understand how this world works?
Not I mean I think it fed into the world building, but I mean, a love of nature, and especially of those parts of nature that large groups of people don't generally like, was always a big thing for me. I suspect it's partly because I was a very disaffected and weird kid, and therefore I kind of took as my tribe and as the things that I would sort of stan, the things that other people didn't like, the things with a bad press, and hence spiders and insects and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But that I can look back at my earlier reading and absolutely see that kind of that fondness for the weird and the inhuman and the estranged was with me from a very early age.
Hmm.
When I was read there I mean there's a whole kind of genre of, I think, thankfully mostly extinct science fiction now, which there was a ton of aimed at sort of younger readers of science fiction, which was basically square-jawed Earthman sorts out stupid alien problems.
Right. Yeah.
And it is basically just a scientification of colonialist narratives, really. It's just like, we are better. We will go to these alien planets where these aliens are, even if they are vastly technologically superior, are still in some way incredibly stupid. And we will show that we are better than the aliens, no matter what the other things are that are going on. And even as a very young reader, I basically spotted this as bunk. And I also spotted that the aliens were always far more interesting because the human characters being depicted as so square-jawed and perfect and rugged and so forth were incredibly dull,
Mm.
as that sort of archetype usually is. And so it was always the aliens and the robots and the monsters in Doctor Who and all of this. That was always where what I really, really, really liked. And so, and again, it's kind of like someone is telling me, well, these things are the things you're supposed to hate, and these are these are the monstrous things. And I reacted against that by saying, no, in that case, they are mine. I will like these. They shall be my heroes that I will kind of wave the flag for. And that's very obviously gone forward in my writing.
Yeah. How long do you normally take to create a world? I mean, how long do you actually ruminate on a system of a world before you start putting it into print?
It's very hard to say because there's a bit of a conveyor belt process. So I will be at any given time, quite aside from the various stages of editing books, I'll be writing one book, but at the same time, I will have 3 or 4 different books bubbling away in the back of my mind in various stages of kind of cohesion. And I will make notes as ideas come to me. And then usually before I start writing a book, I will have 1 to 2 weeks of very solid sort of bashing the world together. But most of that is just formalizing ideas I've already had.
Yeah. Okay. Have you ever got halfway through a book and realized that there's a crucial part of your world building that this it doesn't work, something wrong with the system?
Yes, I mean that used to happen quite a lot before I got published. When I traditionally I would get to about chapter 7 and realize this isn't working, and I can't tell. I mean, at that point, I wasn't savvy enough about the craft to work out why it wasn't working or do anything about it. But I mean, more recently, there is the original Doors of Eden, i.e., the original book that was going to go out with that title. I got to in gain about chapter 7 and realized there was a key part of the world building which meant actually none of this makes any sense.
Right.
And I could not find a way around it. It was
Right.
just so integral to the setting that just like actually this makes a nonsense of what the book is supposed to be about. I am going to have to write a different book. And unfortunately, what I had unwisely done is mention to my publishers that yes, the next book will be Doors of Eden. So the Doors of Eden turned up very, very early as an entry on Amazon, and people say, "Oh, what's this Doors of Eden you're writing?" And obviously the problem was I wasn't writing it at that point. I had given up on it. I went off to write a different book. That book was called The Brain Garden. I'm sure everyone will be very familiar with my novel, The Brain Garden.
Mm.
Um, the reason they're not familiar is that the publishers took one look at the title, The Brain Garden, and said, under no circumstances are you having a book called The Brain Garden. It sounds like it's about zombies. And so I looked at the book and thought, you know what? We could square the circle here. Why don't we call this one The Doors of Eden? Although it is in no way relating to the book that title originally linked to, but the title does kind of fit. But yes, the original Doors of Eden absolutely died because I had not considered a really key aspect to do, in fact, with linguistics and communication.
Right.
I realized there's no reason, there's no way I can explain why all of these things are able to communicate in a way that would make sense in the particular strictures of this setting.
Yeah.
Thankfully, that is really the one time in recent memory that it has happened. But yeah, it does. It is a thing. And that is and you try to beat that sort of problem out of the world as you're building it, but every so often it just sneaks through.
Right. Okay. Well, your breakthrough book was Children of Time, wasn't it? And obviously that won the Arthur C. Clarke Award. So how much did that change your life, winning that award?
um Genuine, even just from the shortlisting, honestly, because the people's awareness of the book just started going up exponentially just from being on the shortlist
Yeah.
in a way that apparently it's not certainly not guaranteed by any means. Talking to the award admins later, but it just hit something in people's imagination. It was kind of, I think a lot of people were ready at that point
Mm.
for a book that was doing that kind of slightly old school hard sci-fi in
Yeah.
hopefully a new and interesting way. Um, but before the shortlisting, it just that the book hadn't done terribly well. It hadn't been it wasn't widely known, and therefore it was very very prepped to go completely under the radar.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that just brought it to people's attention. And then obviously, yes, the actually winning the award in 2016 was insane, and it completely revolutionized my writing career. So I went from being a sort of modest mid-list fantasy author to an extremely successful science fiction author, basically over the course of 18 months.
Right.
And that book is still kind of the backbone of everything, of my kind of writing earnings. And it's certainly why I'm able to be a full-time writer rather than a most part-time lawyer. So yes, it has it in that case, and this isn't by no means um, the guaranteed result of this sort of situation, but in that case, it absolutely leveled up my
Yeah.
writing career by a very appreciable amount.
Mm. It took you quite a while to get your writing into print, didn't it? Did you ever give up on your dream? Well, obviously you didn't, but did you ever consider giving up on your dream?
Well, there is a whole thing. So I be what re I being a published author was the one thing I wanted to do. All the other stuff I was doing to pay the bills was literally just to pay the bills. But at the same time, I was getting absolutely nowhere. I wasn't really making any progress at all. I was still getting just like dead silence or form rejection letters for basically everything. I'd written 15 books. I'd had 15 books rejected.
Yeah.
And it was having a pretty serious effect on my mental health, honestly, because the sheer frustration of having this one dream, and it remains a formidably difficult thing to do. I came perilously close to taking on a vanity publisher when one responded. And in fact, I mean, bizarrely, the reason I didn't was I contacted the most recent place to reject me for the most recent book and said, "Look, I've had this offer. Does what do you think?" And this was in fact in an agency, and in fact, it's the agency that ended up taking me on,
Mm.
McCheatham and Co. And they were good enough to write back saying, "No, do not under any circumstances do this. This is a terrible idea." Or I would have basically ended up with a huge hole in my bank balance and half a dozen badly produced sort of paperbacks to my name.
Yeah.
But what I said, given that it was having this effect, I would say, right, if I haven't got anywhere by my 35th birthday, I'm going to give it up. And whilst I don't know if that is actually what I would have done or whether I would have bumped it on to 45th or whatever, what actually happened was that same agency for my next book did take me on as a client 2 weeks before my 35th birthday.
All right. Cool. Okay, so going back to Children of Time, obviously you know a lot about spiders anyway, but how much research did you put into spider behavior for that book? And what did you learn about spiders whilst doing that research? That you
Well, it's the other way around. So I came across Fiona Cross's research on the Portiid spiders
All right.
and their genuinely quite remarkable sort of behavioral capabilities. And that was the inspiration to write the book. Because at that point, I wasn't a sci-fi writer. I was doing I was doing a round of fantasy books. I had just finished the Shadows of the Apt series.
Mm.
I'd done, I think, Guns of the Dawn, and I was just starting on the new series. And I read this research about this remarkable spider and thought, well, what would it be like if this spider was the dominant life form on a planet? How would it evolve? What sort of,
Mm.
if it was sapient, what would it sort of do as far as society and civilization, all that sort of thing? And I just wanted to run that thought experiment. And I thought, all right, I'm just going to write this book. It's fascinating. I don't think anyone will necessarily want to read it because it's about spiders, and nobody likes spiders. Well, relatively few people like spiders like I do. But let's give it a go. And I wrote it, and my agents okayed it, and then we narrowly managed to sell Pan Macmillan on it. They weren't terribly keen at the time, because they didn't think anyone would particularly want to read it. But I was doing, I think, just well enough that they were willing to humour me on it. Um, Nobody expected it to do particularly well, and then of course, actually, that turned out to be the book that people were really waiting for, which
Mm,
goes to show you can never really, you don't know what's going to succeed.
mm,
I mean, that's one reason why I kind of wish publishers would. I mean, it feels that the industry is contracting as far as sort of publisher risk taking and agility goes.
mm.
You do still find like mid-list publishers who are more willing to take risks and still have enough kind of oomph to get a book seen and reviewed and that kind of thing. But there's a lot of playing it safe in the industry,
Yeah.
which means that you don't get those surprise discoveries. And then if you look back through publishing, it's always been these weird left field things that suddenly turn up, and that's kind of now the new normal that everyone else is chasing to pick up. I mean, I think that so Travis Baldry, Legend and Lattes, phenomenally successful book, and has kind of started a whole subgenre in and of itself, or at least I don't know, it started popularized that subgenre. That was self-published before it was taken on by a mainstream publisher. I believe I'm correct in saying that. And I feel that it's not a book that a publisher would necessarily have taken on at the time, because they would have thought, well, what is this? This is not a thing that we do.
Mm.
But of course, it was the thing that people liked.
Yeah.
And you've got to take risks in order to find that new, the new hotness, as it were.
Yeah. Do you think in many ways it's easier to portray an alien life form as something like an insect rather than just like a green-skinned person?
Oh, well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that one, of course. So, um, I mean, to me, writing hard sci-fi is very different to write about an Earth creature that has been uplifted, like the spiders in Children of Time,
Yeah.
to writing a genuine alien creature, like, for example, the microbial organism in Children of Ruin in the same series, even, or writing about the ecology in Alien Clay and that sort of thing, because there is a certain momentum and direction that or trajectory, I think is probably the word I want, that thing from Earth has that an alien creature needn't have. So it's a different thought experiment in that sense. I there is obviously a colossal amount of extremely problematic baggage that comes with the humanoid alien,
Mm,
and a lot of that is from those sort of stories that I was talking about, which are also kind of, they evolve from your John Carter of Mars and the pulps and that kind of thing, and they are, like I say, those stories are frequently directly evolved from what would previously have simply been historical fiction set over there where those people live.
mm,
Except eventually you run out of over there, and so over there becomes out in space. But it's still the same kind of stories of cultural or racial superiority going on. So having your green-skinned people or your pointy-eared people or your whatever is, I think, inherently problematic. I don't think that simply making your aliens insects necessarily gets rid of that problem if you are still telling the same story. I mean, if you're telling the same story of humans' superiority over the
mm.
ravening insect horde,
Yeah.
that is absolutely still the same kind of narrative. And the fact that they are in, I mean, there's a whole set of bad guys, basically. Though you have robots and you have zombies and you have insects. And in slightly older fantasy stuff, then you get like the hordes of orcs or the hordes, or they're undead. Undead are the classic fantasy one. But the category of bad guy that you're allowed to massacre in their thousands and tens of thousands and not care about.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why the popularity of zombie narratives makes me kind of uncomfortable, because I kind of feel that this is just like there is an element to this. It's certainly not the be all and end all of the genre, but there's an element to zombie stuff where it's just like, yeah, this is the genre where you're basically allowed to kill people because of the zombies,
Yeah.
but they're still kind of people, and you even get there frequently that they may be people you know, and they're people you didn't like, and now you're allowed to kill them because they're zombies or they're infected or whatever the hell is going on. So there is, I think it's something that is very often said, but science fiction and fantasy is inherently political, and it's one of those many areas where people say, "Oh, you shouldn't put politics in X," and it's just no. There's already politics in X. It's just that it's very easy to make it political in a reactionary way, and people don't necessarily think of that as politics.
Yeah, I've got to admit, it's one of my pet hates. The sort of older science fiction, like the John Carter of Mars. I mean, it could just be, it's just basically an adventure story, isn't it? They've just stuck it in Mars on
Yeah,
Mars.
I mean the thing is that
So,
there's nothing inherently wrong with that kind of venture stuff. And if you want to set it in space so you can have weird space stuff, I absolutely understand that. That is why I like science fiction and fantasy over other genres, is because you can have all the other stuff and also spaceships and or dragons add to
mm,
taste.
yeah.
It's just that it's it's distressingly easy. I think purely because of the strength of the cultural narrative involved, to end up retelling highly problematic stories without necessarily realizing it. I mean, there's all sorts of little markers, like it's very, there is a whole kind of school of goblins as sort of greedy, miserly, financially related characters.
Mm,
And it's been going for long enough that it's quite easy to dip into that without necessarily realizing that actually what it is there's a direct line from those goblins to Jewish stereotypes, for example.
right. Yeah.
And it's very well documented, but because we're kind of used to this particular goblin idea, and which is by no means the only sort of fantasy goblin thing out there. They're not Tolkien's goblins aren't like that, for example, or the Warhammer goblins aren't like that. But that is a subset of fantasy goblins, and it directly derives from extremely harmful bigotry.
Mm, mm. Well, obviously, you've written both fantasy and science fiction. Which do you think you prefer to write?
Um, I mean, my rather pat stock answer to this is I really, really like having the ability to write both as and when I please.
Hmm.
They do. It's also worth knowing that they aren't. It's not a binary. There's a continuum, really, in my head. At one end, you get the hard sci-fi where you've really got to pay attention to what our current understanding of science is and work around that. And on the other end, you've got sort of full-on secondary world fantasy where the rules are what you set, and then as long as you abide by your own rules, you're fine. But you've got things in the middle, like the Final Architecture series is a space opera, so it looks, it has a generally science fiction theme, and certainly when I'm doing the aliens, I'm doing aliens because that's kind of that's just what I like and what I prefer.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the stuff going on with Unspace and so forth is entirely just invented for the series. It's not intended to represent any kind of serious scientific theory.
Yeah.
Um, so when you're writing in the more free expression end, over at the fantasy pole, you get the fun of I'm just going to invent all this mad stuff and put it all together and make sure it stands up, and then I will write in that world. And then when you're writing on the other pole towards the harder science, you basically right, I'm going to construct something interesting and different around things that are real and that we genuinely understand. So there's a particular pleasure in both, I think.
Yeah. On to the Shadows of the Art. So I like the way that you've got both science and magic. And obviously, I can't remember who said it now, but someone said at some point that if science gets so advanced, it'll be distinguishable from magic. So how did you come up with the idea of mixing the both and having them both as a sort of a
I mean, it's worth noting.
balance?
I mean, what so the when I was writing Shadows of the App, the thing I wanted to do with it, and this
Mhm.
was, you got to remember, this was my great big last flourish, the last book I was ever going to write unless something happened with it.
Right.
So I wanted a world I knew very well, and in fact, this was a world I'd run as a role-playing game years before, and I had an awful lot of detail on it. But what I wanted to do with this was produce something that ticked all the epic fantasy boxes. Because at the time, epic fantasy was the thing. It was the Game of Thrones was early on. The Malazan books were extremely popular. All of that was the environment I was writing for. But at the same time, I wanted it to be doing different things to your to in the same way that Malazan does different things to your standard kind of
Mm.
kings and sort of medievals sort of politics and all that sort of thing that you generally got. Um, the technology side of it, obviously, this was when steampunk was starting to become a thing,
Mm.
and it's very much a steampunky sort of technology, and I kind of like that, and I quite one of the things I wanted to do was, rather than do this circular narrative of a traditional fantasy epic, I wanted to do a directional narrative that you tend to get more in science fiction, where the world, the things that are invented and thought of in the world directly change the world, and then the world is different at the end of the series to the than it was at the beginning, rather than just sort of returning the king, defeating the Dark Lord, going back to the age of whatever, and then nothing ever changing again, which is a lot of a lot of fantasy narratives are to do with the restoration of a status quo which the villain has disrupted.
Mm.
And certainly you get very widespread changes to the world of Shadows of the Apt through the course of the books, because of things that are invented and because of the wars that they've had and because of political shifts and things like that.
Mm.
And that was something I very definitely wanted to do. And obviously, having a technology is kind of the shorthand to doing that.
Yeah.
So there are things that are the way that wars are fought gets completely revolutionized several times through the book, just purely because of stuff people are inventing.
Yeah.
Um, but it's worth noting that having technology in your fantasy is actually a very long tradition. There
Mm.
was a very, I mean, for one thing, there was a very long time when you couldn't really get straight up fantasy books into print very easily. Sort of pre the Tolkien revival of what I guess sort of 80s, I think, from about sort of Shannara onwards. Science fiction was what sold. And if you wanted your science fantasy book to sell, you kind of needed to put a certain amount of science fiction into it. Even though you can even see there is a fallen post-apocalyptic world underlying the Shannara books.
Mm.
They have a big fight with a robot early on in the Sword of Shannara. And before that, obviously, you've got McCaffrey's Pern series, which is a fantasy book that she actually got Stewart and Cohen, the Science of the Discworld guys, to science up for her so that she could get it into print.
Right.
Which is why it has that rather interesting sort of setup with them being colonists on a planet with these dragons and fighting off this spaceborne enemy.
Mm.
Um, and going back, if you look at the pulps, which in the 30s, no one is really drawing distinctions between sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, and you get an awful lot of sort of old civilizations, old technology turning up in fantasy.
Mm.
Um, and you can never particularly say, oh well, this is just magic, because the magic is frequently based around some sort of ancient devices and things like that.
Mm.
And it's a tradition that Michael Moorcock was working in with his Hawk Moon books and things like that. So I think all of that stuff I had read basically had me set up for the idea, well, actually, why not a bit of science fantasy?
Yeah.
And I mean, honestly, there's been, that kind of, especially with the steampunk, the injection of steampunk, it's been a reasonably healthy part of the genre ever since, and there's still quite a lot of it about.
Mm. How difficult do you find writing villains in your books, and how do you? Because you always make them quite believable, don't you?
I tend to have two types of villain.
Hmm.
Honestly, I have the villains I really enjoy writing, who tend to have a certain amount of dignity in their end, and they tend to get a decent piece of stage time, and they're frequently sort of semi-sympathetic, or at least they they tend towards the Richard the Third style sort of infectiously amusing psychopathy. And then I've got the ones I don't like, who are just, they are usually, they are just selfish and greedy and corrupt.
Mm.
And they are also very realistic villains, I think more realistic than the sympathetic ones. But they are generally characters that when I'm setting them up like that, you know something dreadful is going to happen to them, and it's not going to be terribly dignified, and it's going to be very funny.
Right. How much freedom do you give your characters? Because obviously you start off with a plot. Do you ever get to a point where you've realised that a character has actually evolved in such a way that it wouldn't react in that way? How much freedom do you give them
Yeah,
to?
I mean, when I get to that point, then I generally, yeah, the character is generally right. I mean, so I don't start with the plot, I start with the world, and then the plot and the characters come out of that world.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so hopefully it's an organic enough process that the characters and the plot are facing the right direction. But every so often you do get to the point where you realize actually the only reason this character is doing this is because I've decided the plot needs them to do it. And at that point you need, right, that will, in that case, either they do something else or I need to give them a better motivation for it. And I mean, more recently with the Tyrant Philosophers series, I've been experimenting with not plotting at all,
mm,
but creating the world really quite rigorously in a lot of detail.
yeah,
And then just kind of, with those inbuilt sort of stresses and pressures that I've given in that starting setup, just letting the characters go and seeing what they do. And
yeah.
that's been occasionally slightly hair raising, but generally very fun process. Certainly, I think I've had more fun writing those books than I've had writing anything else.
Yeah. Well, you've written some Warhammer 40K stories, haven't you?
Yes, and indeed, as of recently, Age of Sigmar as well.
Hmm. How difficult is it to? Because I know you're coming from a role playing background, but how difficult is it writing in somebody else's worlds like that?
It is. It's genuinely. It's certainly the editing process is a whole different game because there is a whole set of rules, and I am not unfamiliar with the setting, but there's a huge amount of detail, especially in the 40K setting as well, because the Age of Sigmar one is younger because they kind of rebooted their fantasy stuff with a more high fantasy edge. But a
Mm.
lot of that is still it's still relatively young, where the 40K universe has been going solidly for decades. I can't even think how many, but I remember it coming out initially when I was in secondary school. So I'm guessing it's been going like 30 to 40 years now, which is
Yeah, I
insane.
think so. Must be.
Um, and it has literally just been generating lore, and some of that lore is probably contradictory, honestly, like the lore of anything like Marvel or Doctor Who or whatever. But there's an awful lot of lore, and there's also they have a very demanding fan base who will
Mm.
absolutely say something if something doesn't fit, and they have a very sort of stern eye for the tone, which is something I'm not. I've run into that a few times, problems with that a few times, just because the way I would write something is not the way they would not that Black Library books would normally be written, and sometimes you've got to change a certain the way characters speak or the way just the
Mm.
general your general narrative approach to fit in with the house style.
Yeah.
My favorite ever, I've told this one quite a lot, but my favorite ever note from on a 40K story was when I had a character mention in passing the fields of kind of golden corn of the agricultural worlds that they had known, and the note came back saying, "No, every single planet in this universe is horrible. There are no nice planets." So they really commit to their world building.
Have they ever come back to you about anything else in the 40K universe that you might have got slightly wrong?
um, yes, I mean it's all fiddly fine detail. I've not got anything kind of
Yeah,
I've not had anything grievously wrong. I've had a few pictures knocked back because they're just like, well, this is not what we think would happen or whatever. But
yeah, yeah.
in general, it's things like the sort of the names of Adeptus Mechanicus characters follow this sort of pattern, or
Right.
that isn't that isn't the way that particular group of things work, or if this is the sort of fight you're having, then you'd probably have one of these, and it's that kind of thing. And generally, though they're not difficult edits to deal with,
Mm.
and when they're like a lot like most edits, honestly, you make the change, and then you can think, yeah, actually, yes, I can see that's absolutely better with that in.
Yeah. Okay. And what are you working on just at the moment?
So at the moment, I am on my kind of own personal editing pass of Children of Strife, which is going to be the
Oh,
fourth book in that series,
yeah.
which is has proved a considerably longer and more complicated writing exercise than most of the stuff I do. So along with that, I'm doing proofs on Bee Speaker, which is the third Dogs of War book, which
Right.
is out next year. And then there's also like a standalone sci-fi book called Shroud coming out early next year, which is now all I think packed off, and I shouldn't need to see it again until it's actually out.
Right. Okay. Oh, well, thanks for joining me, Adrian. It's been a really interesting chat. Thanks for agreeing to do this.
Oh, in fact, it's always very nice to be asked. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you once again, mate. Thank